Hello everyone, GM. Welcome back to another episode of Overpriced JPEGs. Except today is not a normal episode of Overpriced JPEGs. In fact, it may be fair to say that this is really not an episode of OPJ at all. So to set the stage here, I think I need to give a little bit of context, and maybe a lot of bit of context. About a month ago, I read a story in The Atlantic that I was just riveted by. And it was written by a man named Jonathan Rosen, who has written a book called The Best Minds, which I'll show here. And it told the story of Jonathan's childhood best friend, Michael Lauder, who growing up was, by all accounts, a genius, bit of a child prodigy. He goes on to Yale, graduates in 3 years, and then in his early 20s has a psychotic break and is diagnosed with schizophrenia. And despite that, and despite living with a tremendous amount of hallucinations and delusions, he ends up going to Yale Law School and graduating from Yale Law School. And he becomes this paragon of the mental health community. The New York Times profiles him, and he gets a book and movie deal worth $2 million back in the 90s. And Imagine Entertainment is going to make a movie of his life, and Brad Pitt is signed on to star in this film and play Michael Lauder. So it's this like very happy hero's journey story. And then Michael has another psychotic break and ends up stabbing and killing his pregnant girlfriend, who he was living with at the time. And so there is this suddenly very tragic ending. And there's so much about this story that I found just really fascinating and of course tragic. And you've got the genius and you've got the madness and just elements of it that are frankly very cinematic in and of themselves. And then there are themes that get touched on here that I found really interesting. So first of all, there are policy implications here. And I want to be wary because I am not trying to give any political opinions or even my own policy opinions in this episode, though it's clear that Jonathan, the author, has some of his own opinions as he's dug into this story. But I will say it's relevant for a couple reasons. Mayor Eric Adams here in New York recently put forward a proposal around unhoused mentally ill people, basically making it easier to hospitalize people against their will. And there's been a lot of pushback to that. I don't know enough about this issue or about the various policies or how they've worked in the past. But for many of us who are living in cities, this is a big conversation right now. I think it's a big conversation, frankly, happening in the tech world because cities like San Francisco and New York and some of these hubs of technology are dealing the hardest with the homeless problem and with folks who are unhoused, mentally ill, and struggling. So that tie-in felt interesting to me. And I think Jonathan's perspective here is interesting. Again, I'm nervous because this is not like I know this issue in and out. And so I'm not trying to espouse any particular policy per se, but I am interested in hearing Jonathan's perspective on it. And a theme that comes up again and again in this conversation and in this book is the idea of good intentions gone awry. And so you see things like because of Michael's genius, he gets a lot of special treatment that in the end may have ended up being more harmful than helpful for him. And I think it's interesting looking at the tech industry and crypto in particular, like our love of genius or love of the perception of genius can often lead to us enabling behaviors that are really harmful. I think of somebody like an SBF. And so I think there are themes here that are relevant to people who are in tech, who are in crypto, who are living in this world. I think you guys will enjoy this episode. The other thing I'll say about this is obviously this is an experiment, and to let you all in a little bit on the background of what's happening here for me, Overpriced Media is making some exciting moves. We're actually fundraising right now, and that's something I'll probably speak about a little bit more sometime in the future. But I am interested in starting a second show at some point. So I love doing Overpriced JPEGs. I will not be stopping doing Overpriced JPEGs, but I do have other intellectual curiosities and itches that I want to scratch, and I want a place where I can do that. So this is a little bit of my first foray into that. I don't know that ultimately the second show that I launch will really be like this episode necessarily. It probably won't be actually in terms of the themes that I'm talking about, but I don't know. And so this was a really amazing opportunity to get to have a conversation with somebody outside of the JPEG world. It's very far outside of the JPEG world. It was very sweet. Jonathan listened to some episodes of the show and was like, I'm happy to come on, but I want you to know I have listened to your show and I still have no idea what it's about. And I was like, don't worry, man, you are not going to be asked any questions about crypto. So this was really just an opportunity for me to scratch some other itches, and would love to hear from you about how you like this, if you hate it, and if there are other topics that you think it might be interesting for me to dive into as we start to play around here in the overpriced world. So anyhow, I also have not put any ads on this episode because I didn't think it was fair to advertisers to run their ads against material that they have not approved or signed off on, or that they may even feel uncomfortable with to some extent. So please enjoy this ad-free episode of Overpriced JPEGs. Let's just start from the beginning. I would love for you to tell folks a little bit what Michael was like as a kid before everything happened.
He was very precocious, and he also was usually the person telling you about his own prodigious feats. Whether it was eating, I inhaled a pizza, or I read the book last night, and it would be a huge book. And I think what I often admired, envied, competed with was that enormous confidence that almost created a space for him. He was really smart.
Was that pomposity that you describe? Were people off-put by that? Were other people like, oh, this kid thinks he's the bee's knees? I don't know.
The thing is, the markers of intelligence that were precocious didn't make much of an impression. I understood them because I grew up in this bookish literary house. My mother was a writer. Michael's mother went to work in an office after the kids were old enough, but kids in New Rochelle who we knew lived in like palazzos. And so there was a certain feeling of distinction. He was very attuned to those. So it's, well, they had gold fixtures in the bathroom, but I have read Beowulf.
Yeah.
And the two of us also, for some reason, grew up believing that being smart was just the most important thing you could be, that it was a kind of achievement all on its own, not a thing you would use to do something, but like the end of the journey already. And so the two of us were constantly engaged in pursuits that were displayed intelligence. And it was almost by common agreement that meant you were going to be spared the sorrows of the world somehow. And that later played an enormous role when Michael developed schizophrenia, simply because mistaking intelligence for sanity, or believing that your mind was equipped to think its way out of all your problems, no matter what they were, was ingrained in us.
Part of the reason I'm interested I'm interested in all of this. I just find it fascinating. But that force of personality and that force of intelligence, I'm interested in digging at how it played out, maybe to his detriment later in life. And I think especially when you're a kid and you feel like maybe on some level you're lacking in some way because you don't have as much money, or you in whatever form it takes in your own mind, you feel like you don't fit in with the culture that's cool. You then hold on to, well, this is why I'm better, right? Like I've read Beowulf, to your point. When does schizophrenia usually show up for people? It's in your late teens, early 20s, right? It's not something that you are typically going to find when you're 8.
No, there's always anomalous cases, and there are stories of people who are very young. But there's a very long, what's called a prodromal period, where you haven't had a psychotic break, but you're living already in a world of partial hallucination or delusion. And Michael graduated Yale, and we both went to Yale. He graduated in 3 years. He went to work for Bain, which was a management consulting firm. And this was in mid-'80s, when those things were just getting going. And it was just like, to be really smart, this is how he described it, and talk about things you actually don't know anything about will earn you tons of money. We were both going to be writers, and his plan was 10 years of this, and then he would just live off of what he earned. But in the course of that year, already he began to feel that the people who hired him were out to get him. He began to see the secretary as somehow demonic. He occasionally saw her with fangs, with claws, and he didn't tell anybody this. And eventually he had a full psychotic break. He thought his parents had been replaced by Nazi replicas that looked exactly like his parents. And that was when he armed himself with a knife to defend himself. And that was when he went to the hospital.
So he goes off to Bain. That's when things really start to veer off for him. And he ends up leaving Bain. And is he back at New Rochelle at that point?
Yes. So he went back to New Rochelle, moved into the turret attic of this big house on the water at the south end of New Rochelle, which he referred to as the Gatsby house, which was a kind of romantic house, and he was writing in the attic. Now, being isolated, staying up all night, staring out the window at the Long Island Sound is not a great thing to do if you're in a prodromal state, but it is exactly what you do when you want to become a writer. And so I just thought, ooh, he's doing that. It happens, and I should say something about this, I suppose, that the house was owned by psychiatrists. It's this amazing mansion at the south end where Michael lived in the attic. It was owned by two psychiatrists.
So he didn't go there specifically because they were psychiatrists and he knew something was wrong?
Not at all.
Interesting.
The House of Psychiatry is this house which really represented community psychiatry, which really grew out of the 60s. And it was this idea that you could care for people in the community. And President Kennedy had called for closing the hospitals, essentially, and this new mode of care. And they were pioneers in that. Unfortunately, it was a disaster simply because the community mental health centers didn't really care for the kind of people who were formerly hospitalized. And when Michael got sick, all his care came from that world. And these were people whose formative influences were like Irving Goffman, a sociologist who studied asylums and likened them to concentration camps. Total institutions, that they were the things making you sick. They weren't where you went when you were sick. So, and this had real implications for the later policies and the ruins that Michael wandered out into once he needed a kind of care.
This is something we might get into more at the end when we talk about lessons, to the extent that you feel there's lessons you want to take from all of this. But to summarize this, I feel like something that you really get at in the book and what you're saying here is you had this movement in the 60s, it was, right? This deinstitutionalization movement that said it's inhumane that we're putting these people in these asylums, right? And I think some of that came from a good place because you obviously have a history of women getting locked up because we don't understand depression or postpartum, or there was certainly a history of putting people away who have what we would, by today's standard, would not be something you'd want to put somebody away from. But it was taken to such an extreme that what happened is there was no distinction or differentiation between somebody who's severely psychotic and fully losing touch with reality and somebody who has depression that they're dealing with, and that there is a distinction there to be made in terms of how we look at and treat people. Is that really in some ways at the core of what
that's
thinking about here?
That's a big piece of it. What people often don't remember or know is that when state hospitals or asylums were created in like the 19th century, early 19th century, really, they were a deeply humane advance because people who were severely ill were locked in basements, were chained to walls, or beaten because they were considered possessed. There was no sense of a diagnosis. There was a sense it was a character flaw and failing. And so people like Dorothea Dix, who was a great reformer and religious Protestant, went around and persuaded every governor in the country in the 1830s, say, that if you're a civilized state, you need to have a place that offers true asylum. And when they were built, they were airy and light, and they were not overcrowded. And you can imagine if somebody has bipolar disorder today, and we don't know what that is, but when they are cycling into a phase where they need to be in a calm environment outside of the city, it was believed, with actually a small amount of truth, that urban environments can really make things worse. Even if you're severely ill and it's a biological disease, which they didn't know, environment still matters. But over time, they changed dramatically, and many things happened to turn them into these overcrowded places that were really holding pens. But instead of reforming them, and this is something I'm always amazed by, in the post-World War II world, the notion was we need to tear them down and replace them with something new. So community mental health centers were outside of the state system. If they had reformed the state system, then hospitals could have been scaled down, made humane. They already were experimenting with satellite programs. And so if you became sick again enough to need a hospital bed, you could go into a hospital bed. But instead, there was this sort of optimistic idea that you would create this new, as President Kennedy said, it was like the warm embrace of the community, but very hard to legislate. So yes, it was very good reasons for wanting to empty those state hospitals.
Well, and that is the subline here of the book, right, is a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intention. So I think the good intention piece I want to come back to in a couple of moments as we continue on this story. I do want to circle back to this challenge around folks with illnesses like these not wanting to take their medication. You and I have talked about my grandmother later in life after a brain hemorrhage was paranoid, delusional, struggling with schizophrenia, and very adamant about not taking medicine. And as a kid, I just remember, you have this distinct sense of what's right or what's of fairness as a kid. And I just remember feeling like, why can't you, my mom, right? Like, why can't you make her take this? Why can't the doctors make her take this when clearly this is right and she's wrong and you guys are seeing the truth? And I know there's things happening in New York right now that Mayor Adams is putting forward that would make it easier to hospitalize folks who are struggling, whatever. So, and there's controversy around that. So I want to get to that at the end, but coming back to the story. So you've got Michael in the Gatsby house, and interestingly enough, okay, I now realize not actually under care at that point, because it was not known at that point that he was schizophrenic. And then, so is the moment that it came, everyone I say, but was when he believed his parents were Nazis and he armed himself with the knife, and there was a moment in the house. Is that, as far as you know, when other people realized what he was struggling with?
That's when my parents called to tell me that he was in a psychiatric hospital, that he was in a locked ward, a phrase I'd never heard before, which is just what it sounds like, and stunned me. And that he'd been patrolling the house with a kitchen knife, as my mother said. And the terror in her voice and the terror she'd absorbed from his mother was not only or simply the idea of someone armed, but that it was his parents. His parents, that is truly like a horror movie, that the people who raised you, you think look like your parents, but are not, and they mean to kill you. And so to be locked inside of that is terrible. The reason why that particular thing matters so much to me is because there's a great deal of argument or fear of saying that violence accompanies someone who is unmedicated and ill in a certain way. But it doesn't need to be violent intent for someone who doesn't recognize what reality is to do something that may even feel like self-defense. But it was the fact that he was in a dramatic episode, hospitalized.
So there's an interesting incident you describe, I think, when you first go to visit him in the hospital, where he asks you to smuggle in a book.
Yeah.
And you're prepared to do it. I want you to talk about that, because I have a question around it.
So first we spoke on the phone. I asked him if there's anything he needed. He asked for tefillin, which are something Orthodox Jews, a man wraps around his arm and puts on his head. And I thought long leather straps were not a good idea for someone in the hospital, but he also wanted a book, The Literary Guide to the Bible, and he wanted a tape recorder, and he wanted a camera. And I just wanted to be helpful because I felt so mortified that he was ill. I set about doing everything he told me. I went to the bookstore and I bought this book. And I had to hide the book, he told me. I had to conceal it because they wouldn't let me in with it. And I did, partly because I was used to his authoritative tone, and partly because of the conviction with which he said it. It made perfect sense to me. It was really only when my wife, she wasn't my wife then, just my girlfriend, but she worked in hospitals. I could see by the nature of her smile that something was wrong. And what was wrong was that I had actually entered his delusion, and that they were not going to keep me from walking into the hospital with a copy of a scholarly literary guide to the Bible. And what I think amazed me was it made me feel how porous, almost contagious someone's delusions might be. They're not, of course, but...
Well, what I'm so curious about in this is it someone's or is it Michael's? Because this is the thing that I find so interesting, and I want to get to this as we get to what happens at Yale and things, is it feels like his force of personality and force of intellect remained. And in some ways, that's what makes this such a fascinating story and makes him such a particularly interesting figure, because he got a lot of acclaim later. And I imagine some of that was because he was still able to seem so compelling even while he was delusional. And this feels like a harbinger of exactly that like in that moment he has you like hiding a book, even though you're like, wait a minute, I don't need to be doing this.
Yes. So absolutely, that's true. The way I sometimes thought about it, maybe for Michael, was that he was like someone who had a great fortune and beautiful clothes, but all he had left, because he lost everything in the crash, was like this one suit. But when he wore the suit, he wore it with such conviction that everybody just assumed he also had the job and the house and the car and the secretary, and they treated him accordingly. His suit was his articulating ability. He would weave that persuasive aura, but it may actually have taken all of his energy to do that. His great achievement was persuading people that he was someone inside of their world of intelligence. So when he told me to hide the book, I was like, okay.
The book. Well, yeah, let's skip ahead because he obviously, so he ends up in the psychiatric ward. He spends time there in a halfway house, a period of quote unquote recovery, though, of course, again, this isn't something you're cured of. And in that time, gets into all of these law schools, decides he wants to go to Yale. I'm speed running us through this a little bit. I know.
He applied before his break to law schools. When he was in the hospital, he got into all of them, deferred them all except for Yale. I mean, rejected them all. That's how he put it. He rejected the law schools, except for Yale, which was deferred. But he was truly delusional at the time. I mean, the way he wrote about it later was in what was going to be his memoirs. Like he said to his brother, defer Yale. The monkeys are eating my brains. But so he was lucky to have been in a hospital for 8 months. It was a private hospital. And his father persuaded him. They wouldn't have held him otherwise because it was very hard to be admitted to a hospital in those days. Being sick was no longer the justification. This was part of the institutionalization. Almost to slam the door behind you, they changed the requirements to imminent danger. And so violence almost became a symptom and the only symptom that mattered. And you can understand why that would also build a kind of stigma into the idea of the illness. And I can't think of another illness that being sick doesn't qualify you for treatment.
Right.
Only a form of behavior.
Right. Wow. That's an interesting point. So getting to, he gets to Yale and he can't do the work.
It was a shock for me when I began to speak to his professors to realize that he couldn't do the work because that was not how his story was told.
By him.
By him to the Times, which then told it for him. And so it wasn't simply told by him. Eventually, everybody was telling it. It was he was written about when he graduated from Yale Law School, or actually 2 years later, because they created a special fellowship for him. But for him, the special fellowship was in recognition of his genius. For him, his accommodation was that he was so smart that they recognized his ability, but one of his professors said to me, I never thought he would be a Yale lawyer. I thought he'd be someone who went to Yale, who was a spokesman for people with schizophrenia. But Michael used to say to me, why would I work at Macy's, which was one of the suggested jobs when he was gradually regaining himself after the halfway house. Why would I work at Macy's when I can be a Yale lawyer? So for him, that was, of course, why he was there. And they were accommodating him out of great kindness, but there was already a gap between what they thought he could do and what he could do.
Do you think he mistook that kindness as evidence of his exceptionalness?
Yes, but there's no question about it.
Because that's one of the questions I had, which is like, how do you feel like he understood how he was remaining there while not actually doing the work? And you've just answered that. So the corollary to that is, do you see this as one of the big good intentions gone awry, which is that in the spirit of these teachers trying to accommodate somebody that they saw as handicapped in this way, this invisible handicap, which I think you talk about, it was in fact enabling some idea for him that maybe there wasn't really something wrong with him, or he's actually exceptional, which
look, he was exceptional, but he was able to believe that he was not necessarily ill. And so what's amazing to me is that part of what people felt was that by retelling his story in a positive way, they almost thought reality would follow from it, which in itself is a kind of magical thinking. So when the Times wrote up his story, he explained that when he was asked, when he was applying for his a job as a law professor, he'd come out, as he said, as a flaming schizophrenic. He was asked if he ever became violent. And he simply explained to the journalist that's a very hateful stereotype. And it can be a very hateful stereotype, but it happens that I knew as I was reading it was very uncomfortable because I remembered the circumstances of his psychotic break and his hospitalization.
This is the point you were making earlier, the violence piece you're talking about. People may have missed it earlier when you were mentioning this, when he had that episode with his parents and the Nazis, the delusion there. You don't have to be a violent person who, if you're having very strong delusions and you genuinely believe your parents have been replaced by Nazis, at that point, it's rational to do something either outright violent or bordering on violent. Getting a knife to arm yourself is a rational thing if you genuinely believe your parents have been replaced by Nazis. So it says nothing about Michael as somehow an inherently or intrinsically violent person. He's actually behaving incredibly rationally within a moment of deep delusion.
That's a perfect and important thing to say, though, by the way, that his rational manner remained, but it was based on an irrational premise when he had that delusion. And so that's another reason why I listened to him. There was a hyper-logical quality. Always there was something highly logical, there was almost something Spock-like in his manner, which was very rational. And so, but if you saw reality wrong, and then logically things would follow from it. The only thing I want to throw in there's a tremendous desire to believe that environment is responsible for everything, because that way no one is ever inherently different. And out of almost a liberal desire to save him, that presumption was encouraged in his very professor, mentor, helpers. And so they were changing the story or simply allowing him, like telling me to wrap the book in brown paper. And they were doing the same thing. And
they were doing his bidding in terms of how he wanted the narrative told and framed.
Some of that's the force of his personality, but some of that is a notion that to notice a distinction or a difference, even though you know it's a severe illness, is to stigmatize it. Whereas in fact, acknowledging the difference and then trying to help it by medicating or caring for it or accommodating it truly would be destigmatizing potentially.
Right.
And in a sense, that was part of the tragic element of the thing, that people kept hiding or evading or simply wanting it to be a certain way.
Well, that's, I think, the one of the metas that you're grappling with throughout this whole thing is this liberal and well-intentioned desire for destigmatization. I feel it as we talk about this, right? It's uncomfortable. You don't want to perpetuate harmful stereotypes about the mentally ill. And yet there is we need to deal with the reality of certain situations. And you touch on that a little bit, I think, in a story about there's a pretty severely mentally ill Black woman who's living on the street and flashing herself and defecating in public and all these things. And there's a wing of people who are saying, oh, she's empowered. It would be wrong to force her to change anything or into a home. And it's her daughters who are like, you have to be racist if you think that this is actually empowering for this woman.
And it was her sisters who would they weren't allowed to testify. They described themselves as being proud, working class, religious Black women. And they wanted people to know that their sister had been raised in that kind of home. And that if the judge, who actually said she may not conform to our bourgeois notions, essentially, of middle-class behavior, but she's leading a fiercely independent life. And what they said is, if it was his wife or daughter, he wouldn't tolerate it for a second. And the only thing they could imagine is that he was a racist, because if that's what he thought a proud and independent Black woman is, what else could the reason be? And that is somebody who thought he was bestowing on her a measure of autonomy and choice, but they had a higher regard for her and they knew her. And so they understood that she had departed from reality, and she was also essentially dying in slow motion on the street. But it is very hard to do. And it is a tiny subset of a fraction of the population who are sick. And part of the problem also is that we now use mental illness to describe half the population. It's a bland, fungible, almost meaningless term that can sometimes be replaced with mental health. He has mental health issues. And so the fear, in a sense, you're trying to gather everyone in, but if everyone is ill, nobody is. And then nobody will be helped. And the people who will be helped least are the ones who need it most and don't even think of themselves as sick.
How do you think it should be handled? Because obviously you have record high rates of anxiety and depression, and I believe in those things. Those are things that we need to talk about and take seriously. I'm totally with you that there is a strong distinction to be made between that and believing your parents have been replaced by Nazis. How do you think that distinction should be handled?
Well, it should be handled in that it should be overtly discussed. So people with severe mental illness, and many people who work with severely mentally ill homeless, will now use that term. It's not even necessarily an actual term. I don't think it exists in the DSM, but it's important to do what was supposed to have been done initially, which was to redefine the group of people who most need help so that they can get the help they need. But if it becomes a civil liberties issue in a way that makes them representative of everyone's freedoms, then an anomalous aspect of a severe illness will be mistaken for or misapplied and used as a stand-in for my own liberty, which depends on this person's full liberty. Whereas actually, if I was unconscious on the street, even if you didn't know why, maybe I have low blood sugar, maybe I had a heart attack, I hope you'd call 911 and go to the hospital, evaluate me.
You're making the point here that, and this is, again, jumping ahead in the story, but folks know the ending, right? Like, there's a camp of people who believe if the laws existed, if you could have forced Michael into hospitalization in the weeks leading up to what ultimately happened with Carrie, there's a camp of people who would say, well, if you can violate his civil liberties like that, right, hospitalize him against his will, then somehow that's an infringement on all of our civil liberties. And it's a slippery slope until it could be next that we're hospitalizing you because we don't like your views. And your point is, oh, come on, give me a break. Would that be a way to say it? If we
never say
do it
that
flippantly, you wouldn't say it flippantly. Yeah.
Also, people use hospitalization as a kind of shorthand for putting people back in the non-existent back wards of giant state hospitals, which are mostly ruins out in the countryside. There are barely hospital beds. In fact, there aren't enough hospital beds, either in acute care hospitals or in state hospitals. Also, Medicaid doesn't reimburse states for people in state hospitals. An amazing exclusion, which means that states have an incentive to release people. And so at every level, what I would say is people need to know as much as they can. Now, the problem people were bringing up about, say, the mayor's plan is if you're going to bring people to the hospital, police can't commit someone, but they can bring someone to the hospital to be evaluated by doctors. If those people then need hospitalization, they should get it. There's no long-term hospitalization even available for them. There are programs that can sometimes help persuade people, assisted outpatient treatment. There's a civil court, there's a judge, and just the presence of the judge saying, if you don't take this medication that you need, and there's a due process, and the families are the ones who might bring the case, and you get reevaluated, and there need to be safeguards.
Just briefly give folks the TLDR on what Mayor Adams here in New York is, what his program is, because it's gotten a lot of pushback, but it's trying to address this.
One of them is that if there are people who are unhoused, which means that they don't go to shelters, they're incapable of caring for themselves and too sick to know that they are sick, but are severely ill, they can be taken to a hospital for evaluation. There are other elements in the plan. That's the piece of the plan that led to headlines in major newspapers that said homeless to be rounded up even if they're not violent. Mentally ill homeless to be rounded up even if they're not violent, as if, paradoxically, because they thought they were championing the rights of the mentally ill homeless, as if being violent were the only symptom that should matter.
That's your point. Like, being sick isn't enough. It has to have this like tragic outcome.
But the other pieces of the plan involve these assertive treatment teams of people that include psychiatrists and psychiatric social workers, and there need to be many more of them, but setting us funding for them to go around and keep track of every single person who's unhoused, severely ill, can't care for him or herself, and to get them what they need, not to pick them up, by the way. These teams, the Times did a story recently in which the person followed them around for 7 months, and they're the most extraordinarily patient people. They're totally non-judgmental. But they themselves, there's one moment, they want to keep people out of the hospital if they can. Somebody was released after 5 days and with medication that they knew he would not take. That's what it means to be failed by the system. And the only thing I would add, the one thing I'd say about a civil liberties argument is that if you're defending someone's right to make a choice, even though actually they don't know what's real enough to know that they're making a choice, then you can do that. But what I would say is if you believe that everyone has the right to free speech, but they cannot yell fire in a crowded theater unless there's a fire, what would you say if the fire only existed in someone's mind? Would you let them yell fire? If not, then you need to acknowledge that there are certain states that are outside of the ordinary realm that we use to determine people's civil liberties. Well,
and that gets us back to the Yale teacher, right? Like, at what point is it moral to create exceptions for people who are unwell? And at what point is it enabling and harmful to create these exceptions for people who are struggling with something deeper?
The one thing I want to add also in a way is, again, about the law professors. They agreed that intelligence was all in all.
Mm-hmm.
And so by sharing it with him in a sense, or by allowing him to have it in the way he imagined he did, they were, in their minds, rescuing him by making sure he was seen as somebody who had worth, because that was their own currency, their own unit of measurement. They also were reluctant, because of their generation, to think of biological differences as being determinative. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the idea that biology was used to determine people's worth was exactly what eugenicists had done. And the recoil from that was that, no, it's only environment. And if we fix the environment, people will all be the same. And so psychoanalysis, which was entirely based on the belief in the environment, your mother gave you schizophrenia, and they called them schizophrenogenic mothers, a really low point in the history of psychiatry, that was preferable in a way to believing that you might have a genetic predisposition for a kind of illness. Although, of course, how can you treat it if you don't identify it?
And by the way, like, all of this is silly because in the sense that you don't have a lot of control over your environment either when you're young, right? If it was the environment that determined it over the biology, it's actually not as controllable, I think, as people with that view want to make it out. One of these things is incredibly controllable and the other is completely deterministic. So let's get to this New York Times piece comes out. Out of the New York Times piece comes a book deal and a movie deal with Imagine Entertainment, if I'm not mistaken.
He was good copy. He was, because he spoke so well. And I'm not entirely sure how it came about, but the story was that about a young man who had decided to come out, as he put it, as I said, as a flaming schizophrenic, because he hadn't been able to get hired when he concealed it. The reason he hadn't been able to get hired when he concealed it is because he hadn't done the things that people have to have done. So he went from not getting a job to being profiled as a guy who couldn't get a job, to suddenly selling a proposal for a book and a movie to Ron Howard, who was going to make the movie, who had just made Apollo 13, and it changed his life, which is exactly what we thought writing did. Life thwarts your genius. You somehow talk about the trouble, and that becomes the very substance of your success.
Right.
And so he was going to tell the story.
It's also this hero's arc. It's like this classic journey of you had this depth and then you've risen above it, essentially.
Michael suddenly moves into an apartment with his girlfriend. Is engaged to be married to her. He's living with a view of the river in Hastings-on-Hudson. But he can't write his book. And his book is based on the story that he told Hollywood, which has whispered it back to him. And it's not his story, really. And he's not well. And he stops taking his medication. And he begins to think of his girlfriend as being an alien imposter. And he kills her. And he flees and winds up in Ithaca. The forensic psychiatrist who found him not guilty by reason of insanity said Michael thought he was being pursued by an alien who wanted to kill him and torture him to death. And that's why he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And indeed, when he got to Ithaca, he flagged down a police officer. And amazingly, they didn't handcuff him or anything. They didn't really believe him, because...
So he said, he arrives on this campus and this police officer sees he's covered in blood and is, "Are you okay?" And he's saying, "I think I did this thing.
My girlfriend or a wind-up doll," he said. But he seemed to the person who found him, first she thought he'd fallen into one of the gorges at Cornell because he was bloody, or that he'd been the victim of an assault. Then she just felt he was disoriented. And then she also felt a sense of danger, partly because when she touched him, he balled up his fist. But still, it was only when the sergeant there called Hastings finally and said, "This is going to sound off the wall, but I've got a guy here who's telling me this." And again, why would you kill someone in Westchester, drive to Binghamton, and then take a bus to Ithaca to confess to a police officer? So you think it's off the wall. And when the police officer in Hastings came back on the line, he said, "Hold him. He's done just what he said he's done." Basically, 3 years after being in the New York Times, heroically profiled, he was on the cover of the New York Post under a massive headline that said "Psycho," one word. Huge letters, bigger even than when Son of Sam was captured and we were kids.
Were the police had already been to the apartment even before they got the call from the Ithaca campus police because his mother had called the police believing something was wrong?
Because the day that Michael killed Carrie was the day in which they were trying to get him help because his illness had escalated. And in fact, it's telling about the world of psychiatry that was caring for him that the daughter of the woman who owned the House of Psychiatry was talking to her mother, and her mother was explaining that Michael was in terrible shape. And the woman said to her mother, what are you going to do about it? And what are you and the psychiatrist going to do about it, who was actually caring for Michael? And she said, we can't do anything. And that stunned her because how is it possible people who had devoted their lives to caring for people with severe mental illness could do nothing? And that's how they felt the night before. And so then, of course, it was the world of aftermath and everything was different because someone was dead.
Was that true? Was there actually nothing that could have been done right before, or was part of this out of the community's belief that you shouldn't necessarily do anything because the institutions were the worst outcome?
Well, it's an interesting comment. They didn't think he was going to kill anybody.
Right.
They thought perhaps he would have a massive psychotic break and wind up in what was called the revolving door, going in and out of hospitals. Or maybe they thought he might harm himself. But nobody thought he was going to kill somebody, which is interesting too, because his state when he was truly psychotic was not an extension of his personality. It was an illness that was asserting itself in an irrational way that was an aspect of that illness. But it was also the case that an intervention team came to their apartment a week before he killed Carrie, and Michael answered the door and was able to pull himself together enough to say, thank you, no, I appreciate it, and take the card and say he would call if he needed help.
And why had that welfare check come? Had family called for it?
I'm not sure who called. It could have been a family member. It could have been the doctor. So many people feel but he would have to have been hospitalized until he could be stabilized. Mm-hmm. And that required a different mindset entirely. And the psychiatrists who were caring for him were really focused in a kind of leftover way, but understandable too, saving him from the system, not from his illness. Right. And so there was in that sense a way. But what you were saying earlier was that, yes, his mother, who had spoken to Michael earlier in the day, Carrie, his girlfriend who he killed, stayed home from work. And they were all on the phone. And when the mother called because she was very concerned about something Michael had said, she called back and Michael answered the phone. And the mother said to Michael, please give the phone to Carrie. And Michael said, I can't because I've killed her, or I think I've killed her. And so she had called the police. The police station was about 100 feet less from Michael's apartment. And they went over and they found that he was gone and she was dead.
And something like what Eric Adams is proposing wouldn't solve for something like this, because this was not somebody who was unhoused. This is somebody who who presented a month previously like they were healthy, or could what Eric Adams is proposing now have helped in this case?
The way that what Eric Adams is proposing couldn't have helped, but it is part of a repair that has to happen at every level of government. Like only the state can create the beds for psychiatric patients. And I don't think Michael could have afforded to go back to a private hospital. So would there have been, if there had been a decent state system, if he had had a doctor who felt comfortable ordering him to be held for 72 hours. And in that 72-hour hold, he still couldn't have been medicated. He could have refused medication, but would it have been possible for someone to sue to get him medicated? Or might there have been an assisted outpatient treatment program, which is something devised after a woman named Kendra Webdale was pushed in front of a subway car the year after Michael killed Carrie. A guy who'd been hospitalized 13 times in 2 years, who had literally gone into Bellevue saying, fine, I need to go live somewhere. I'm having bad thoughts. And they gave him a phone number, basically, and noted that he had no phone. And he then pushed this woman in front of the subway.
Just pausing on that, I mean, that if ever there was a case for the anti-civil against the people who want to be like, oh, this is all just natural, is this person basically begging for help, saying, I don't want to be having these bad thoughts, and then nothing gets done, and then they hurt somebody else.
Right. So in a sense, deinstitutionalization has happened, but there's still a remaining culture, and that culture has to change. And people's fears are understandable, but it is important for for people to understand that the whole reason why it was a mercy when there were diagnoses is because it wasn't a character flaw. It was
Right.
an illness. It's a
Right.
biological illness. And so it requires treatment the way an illness does. But there are changes that are happening. And in a weird way, his success isolated and insulated him from even that minimal chance of a certain kind of care.
Something I'm so interested by, and hopefully this isn't, I don't know. It's always that walking that line between feeling like voyeuristic or exploitative in some way and being interested in this stuff. But like that somebody who was so ill and couldn't get work done because the contact with reality took so much effort was maintaining a relationship with somebody who was not mentally ill, who was by all accounts an incredible, amazing woman who had a stable job and was quote unquote normal. Do you have any insight into how that relationship functioned? Was Michael able to be normal enough of the time?
It's a complicated thing that waxed and waned, I'm sure, with his illness. But she, from everything I have heard, and I talked to her extraordinary colleagues who really loved her and valued her and admired her enormously, she just loved him. I mean, one of the colleagues said to me, she said to this Carrie, do you ever think maybe it's too much? And she said, unfortunately, I fell for him, lock, stock, and barrel. It almost sounded like a line from a 50s musical. When you're hooked, you're hooked, she said. And when I was working on the book, I wanted to talk to one of Michael's freshman roommates, a guy I really liked enormously, who had died quite young of cancer. And I had learned that when I called. I talked to his wife. He'd married his college sweetheart. He had 3 young kids. But he had died weeping for Carrie. And what he said, and I spoke to his brother, who was a professor at Yale of computer science, what his brother said to me is that literally on his deathbed, what he said was, all we did was worry about how Michael was being accommodated, making sure that he was getting his due in the world. And we forgot, and he meant himself, to worry about her.
I was so riveted by this story when I first read it in The Atlantic. And so then, of course, I went down the rabbit hole and was reading all these old articles, both the original 1995 lauding piece of Michael, but then also the coverage that came out in 98 when this happened. And it is so amazing how reductive this stuff is. Like, you read those articles from 1998 and it feels like a stock version of a person who murders somebody, right? And we see these stories from time to time, obviously horribly, and you're like, and then to realize there's a whole rich backstory before we get to that moment. And it was it's just so interesting now to go back and read those reductive versions of, hey, there's this killer and he murdered his girlfriend, and then understand the history behind all of it.
If I had only known his story through any of those stories, I would not have understood anything.
Right.
And even knowing him, I had to go back to childhood.
In the days, so he's arrested, in the weeks that follow, he was found innocent by way of insanity, right?
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
He wasn't found innocent.
Right.
But it also took a year or maybe even 2 for him to be medicated enough to stand trial. And so he was sent to a forensic hospital. You have to be able to understand the charges against you.
So he remained delusional to the point of not even knowing what had happened. I know at one point he was saying Carrie was in Europe for a full year or so.
Well, until they examined him and felt that he was sufficiently capable of understanding the charges. Then to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, the challenge was to discover the state he was in at the time of the killing. And in a way, his behavior with the police was itself an indicator that he was indeed in the grip of things. The person who found him not guilty by reason of insanity found Jeffrey Dahmer responsible. Jeffrey Dahmer killed, I forgot how many people, and kept them in the refrigerator and snacked on them.
People now know because of the Netflix series the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix series.
But what the psychiatrist said was the reason why he felt Dahmer was responsible is because he had a plan to dissolve the bodies in acid. He got drunk beforehand because he knew what he was doing was wrong. He wore a condom so he wouldn't get an infection. He was doing things that somebody who had a relationship to reality would have done. Right. Whereas even though Michael did many seemingly rational things, the core irrationality was the basis of the thing.
And was he in and a hospital in that year that followed before there was actually able to be a trial.
He was in a forensic hospital, which is like a maximum security hospital.
And where is he today?
He's in the same place for 25 years.
And at this point, they can force medication on a regular.
I think you had to be sued to take it, but then it has its own life. You take it, sometimes it stops working, sometimes you try something else. Meanwhile, you can refuse it. I mean, it is a complicated world even now, but it's a long time to have been living in this new world.
So let me end here, which is to the extent that this is an incredibly nuanced, complicated issue. And again, I don't want to cause stigmatization, but I also want to live in a world of reality. And I feel like what your call is for, in some ways, it's against just abstract black and white, the deinstitutionalization movement that said, no, we can't possibly have any sort of wards. But it sounds like it's a call for the state to intervene in ways where let's build facilities or expand the capacity for great places, quote unquote, for people to go if they are in need of care. And let's try and create systems to make it possible while they're sick and before something awful has happened.
Very sick people should be entitled to the care they need. And if it's a chronic disorder, you need to be able to stay in a hospital as long as you need to be there. And to deny someone that possibility, partly for bureaucratic reasons, is inhumane. But I think I am a writer, really, and I wanted mostly to embody a story that would let people feel what it was like. And that was why I started with my friendship. And I tried to apply that to everything. I had been so angry at certain points in the writing, and that dissolved. It doesn't mean I don't expect people who read it to not be angry. It's just people make their choices. Just you can see why and how they make them sometimes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving so much time here to me today and talking this through. It's, again, complicated and fascinating, and I'm really grateful to you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Overpriced JPEGs. If you liked this conversation, if you liked this episode, please go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps me out, it helps the show out, and it means you will get alerts and updates when we post new content. Thanks again.